All right, crazy kids, my regular government classes, I have missed you. What, it's been a month? A lot of crazy things have happened, like a pandemic and the total collapse of our economy, like the presidential primaries. How many of you voted on March 17th? How many of you were annoyed that everybody had dropped out but Biden and Bernie before Super Tuesday, and well before we had a chance to vote on anybody but Biden and Bernie? And now it's a done deal, right? Fascinating. I'll send you some information on that and how it's impacting the presidential election. But, all right, so here's one of the lessons you guys like. Separation of powers, which sounds boring, I get it. But how it relates to Arizona's speeding statute, how Arizona's speeding statute is an example of separation of powers, and in the process I'm going to teach you how to fight a speeding ticket. Have a piece of paper and a pencil and get ready to take some notes. And be sure and just pause this whenever you need to do something like that, or go get a cup of coffee or whatever. All right. Separation of powers. This idea comes from a French guy named Baron de Montesquieu, from a book written called Spirit of the Laws, where he talks about this. He says there would be an end of everything if the same man or the same body were to exercise those three powers, that of enacting laws, executing those laws, and trying the cause of individuals. All right. In your lesson, I have a link to this web page. Pause the video, go open up the web page and read the story of King Solomon and the baby. All right, so are you back? So what happened? King Solomon, these two women are fighting about whose baby, who the baby belonged to. Imagine some soldiers come up, they're having this argument, and the soldiers say, all right, we're going to take you to the king. And then the king goes through this process. All right, whose baby is it? It's my baby, it's my baby. And then he says, well, bells. Here's the rule, here's the law. The law is, when I have a dispute between two women about whose baby it is, my rule is I'm going to chop the baby in half. Soldiers come up, bring me a sword, I'm going to chop this baby in half. And the one woman says, oh, no, don't chop the baby in half, give it to her. And he says, all right, well then you're obviously the mother, I'm going to give you the baby. So, was he exercising legislative powers? Did he make a rule? Did he make a law for this situation? Was he exercising executive powers? Well, the soldiers worked for him like cops. Cops are in the executive branch. And he also directed his attendant to bring him a sword. And did he act as a judicial power? Did he resolve the case? Now, this is really cool. This is really cool when you have a great wise king. But if you have a dictator, this can be uncool. So, what are the three powers? The legislative power is to what? These are notes, write them down. They will be on your test. The legislative power is to what? Make laws. What is the executive power? The executive power is to execute execute, carry out, enforce. Those are all synonyms. Execute, carry out, enforce laws. Now, the judicial power. How many of you were taught that the judicial power was to interpret the law? Now, that's true, but only in the context of resolving an individual case. Let me give you an example. This guy named Johnson, he goes to the Texas state legislature. He's engaged in a protest, and he shows up, and he takes out an American flag and some lighter fluid, and then he lights it on fire and burns it. Now, he is promptly arrested by Texas police officers for violating a Texas law that makes it illegal to desecrate an American flag. Now, why didn't they say burn an American flag? You know, actually, if you go into the United States, the laws of Congress, the United States Code, there is a provision that says if you want to dispose of a flag respectfully, then you should do what? You should burn it. Now, there's no penalty for not burning a flag, so it's not really a law. There's no punishment for violating it. It's just a recommendation. But Congress even says that you should burn a flag. So they can't make burning a flag illegal. They have to make desecrating a flag illegal. So now Johnson goes to trial, being prosecuted for desecrating an American flag. And in his trial in Texas court, he raises a constitutional defense. He says what? He says, I have my right to burn an American flag is protected by the First Amendment. Now, what does the First Amendment say? Does the First Amendment protect free speech or freedom of expression? And if you read it, it says freedom of expression. So now this goes all the way to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court has to decide what is expression. Is expression more than speech? Okay, now class, did I say a word? Did I express myself? And the Supreme Court says, and we're going to study this more later, freedom of expression that is protected includes symbolic speech, includes speaking when you're not speaking at all, when you're committing an act that is an act of expression. So, in the context of that case, the Supreme Court ruled on whether Johnson's conviction was to be overturned. They said it should be, because he had a freedom of expression right to burn the flag. Very unpopular decision, by the way. But in the context of ruling whether his case should be overturned, his conviction should be overturned, they had to interpret the Constitution. So, what is the judicial power? The judicial power is to resolve individual cases that come up under the law. Resolve individual cases. But in the process of resolving individual cases, the court will have to, many times, usually will have to interpret the law. Excuse me? Interpret the law. By the way, when the law that the court is interpreting is the Constitution, that is called judicial review. So interpret the law, and it was, when it's the Constitution, and I put a capital C, meaning it's the United States Constitution, When it's the Constitution, that is called judicial review. And the famous case on judicial review is MVM, Marbury versus Madison, right? Okay. Now, go to the lesson, and I have sent you a copy of Arizona Revised Statute 28-701. I think the whole scheme set out in our speeding statute is an excellent example of separation of powers. So, open up 28-701 and read the first paragraph. And tell me what is illegal. Because, of course, it is illegal to drive over the speed limit, right? Raise your hands. By the way, raise your hands if you've driven over the speed limit or routinely drive over the speed limit. Yes, I have to raise my hand too. So when I'm driving over the speed limit, is that illegal? Read 28-701, the first paragraph, very carefully and tell me what is illegal. All right, pause it for a second and read that paragraph. All right. Let's take a look at 28-701. Did you guys see it? What is illegal? Hold on. All right. What is illegal in Arizona? What is illegal is driving at a speed greater than is reasonable and prudent. That is what is legal in Arizona. Under the circumstances, conditions, and actual and potential hazards then existing. By the way, this language right here, a person shall control the speed of a vehicle as necessary to avoid colliding with any object, person, vehicle, or other conveyance on, entering, or adjacent to the highway in compliance with legal requirements, and the duty of all persons to exercise reasonable care for the protection of others. That is what you get ticketed for if you rear end somebody. If you rear end somebody, you have failed to avoid colliding with any object, person, or vehicle, other conveyance on the highway. That's what you get ticketed for. So it's weird. You get ticketed the same, you violate the same statute for speeding or rear-ending somebody. Okay, so what is the role of the speed limit? What role does the speed limit play in our speeding statute? Well, first, let's read section B. So pause it for a second and take a moment to read section B. Okay, section B. Except as provided in subsections C and D, there's C and D below. We'll talk about those in a second. Or except if a special hazard requires a lesser speed, any speed in excess of the following speeds is prima facie evidence that the speed is too great and therefore unreasonable. All right, let's break this down. First of all, if there is no, well, let me back up. Subsection C says, let's look at it. Subsection C says the speed limits of 15, 25, and 65 may be modified by the state or a city after doing a traffic study by a qualified civil engineer. Anybody seen speed limits other than 15, 25, or 65? Yes, they're all over the place. 702 and 703 give the state of Arizona, if it's a state road, or the city, if it's a city road, authority to, when they are designing a road, to have a civil engineer, the person designing it, to look at some national standards and determine what is the appropriate speed limit. So that's where we get speed limits other than 15, 25, or 65. But if there is not a speed limit that is posted, what is the speed limit in Arizona? Well, in a school crossing, whether it's marked or not, is 15 miles an hour. 25 miles an hour in a business or residential district, and 65 miles an hour in all other locations. So I guess technically, if you're on some dirt road somewhere with no speed limits, you can go how fast? Well, it's in the middle of nowhere, so you could probably go 65 miles an hour would be the speed limit. Can you get a ticket for driving under the speed limit? Can you get a ticket for driving under the speed limit? Well, these speed limits all apply unless there is a special hazard that requires a lesser speed. And that's further set out in D. All right, the maximum speed, the speed limit, is reduced to what is reasonable and necessary under the conditions and regard to the actual and potential hazards. You are driving in the middle of a deep fog, and the road says there's a 55 mile an hour speed limit. Can the cop give you a ticket for going 30 miles an hour in a 55 mile an hour speed limit if it is super foggy and you can't see? The answer under 28701D is yes. All right? So, when do you have to exercise extra care? Take a moment, pause, and read D. All right, coming up on a railroad crossing, around a curve, coming around a hill, a narrow or winding roadway, or if a special hazard exists because of weather or highway conditions. You are on a road that has a 65 mile an hour speed limit and you are in the middle of a huge snowstorm. You're going 50 miles an hour and you pass a cop that's going 25 miles an hour. Can he ticket you? And the answer is yes. But if they ticket you for driving under the speed limit, they do not get the benefit of the prima facie rule. So let's go to the heart and soul of the speeding statute on cases that are typical. By the way, these are civil traffic cases. I mean, it's still the same standard for civil or criminal. But understand that if you're going over 20 miles an hour over the speed limit, or if you're going over 85 miles an hour in Arizona, then that ticket can be a criminal ticket versus a civil ticket. So, let's look at this language again. Read B again carefully. What are they talking about when they're talking about prima facie evidence? By the way, this is what happens when you go to court and challenge a speeding ticket. So pay attention carefully. What does prima facie mean? Prima facie is Latin for on its face. What that means in terms of a speeding statute case is meets the burden of proof. Okay, let's play this out how this is going to work in court. So you go in and you challenge your speeding ticket. You are in court. There is a prosecutor representing the state of Arizona. The police officer will be a witness for the government. And then you are there as the defendant. So, how does it play out? So it's the government versus you. The government is the plaintiff. You are the defendant. This is going to be on your test, so write this down. In a civil case, the burden of proof. Imagine the scales of justice. The scales of justice. In a civil case, the plaintiff has to win, has to tilt the scales ever so much, has to tilt the scales by a preponderance of the evidence. Write that down. Preponderance of the evidence. Civil. What is the burden of proof? Civil. Burden of proof. Preponderance of evidence. What does that mean? It basically means that the scales are tilted over 50%. The scales are tilted in the favor of the plaintiff ever so much. All right, everybody got that? In a criminal case, what is the burden of proof? You guys know this from TV. In a criminal case, what is the burden of proof? Beyond a, you got it, beyond a reasonable doubt. So, in a civil case, the government only has to tilt the scales this much. In a criminal case, they have to tilt them this much. They have to prove you guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. In a civil traffic ticket, they have to prove you responsible by a preponderance of the evidence. All right, criminal burden of proof is what? Beyond a reasonable doubt. Beyond a reasonable doubt. Write these down and then I'm going to erase them. All right? So pause and write them down. Beyond a reasonable doubt for criminal. Preponderance of evidence for civil. All right, let's focus on a civil trial on your speeding ticket. The government comes in and they have to prove their case by a preponderance of the evidence. What do they have to prove? What does the government have to prove? What is illegal in Arizona? Is it driving over the speed limit? No, it is not. What is illegal in Arizona? What's illegal is driving in a way that is not reasonable and prudent. That's what the government has to prove. If the government proves you were driving unreasonably, the judge is going to hold you responsible for the ticket. Okay, let's go back to prima facie. Now, don't freak out. This is easier than it sounds. All right. What B says is any speed in excess of the, change this to speed limit. Any speed in excess of the speed limit is prima facie evidence that the speed is too great and therefore unreasonable. All right, you get it? At trial, the government has to prove that your driving was unreasonable. What the prima facie rule says is that any speed over the speed limit is, on its face, is proof that your driving was unreasonable. Okay, follow me? Okay, so what does the government have to prove? So the government has to prove unreasonable driving, right? This prima facie rule throws them a bone, says, hey, government, we're going to make it easy for you. You can tilt the scales, you can prove or provide evidence of unreasonable driving by just proving two things. What two things does the government have to show? And if they show those two things, it is sufficient to meet their burden of proof on unreasonable driving. What two things? Any speed over the speed limit. So what two things are they going to have to prove? Number one, they're going to have to prove what? What are they going to have to prove? Ah, you got it. Your speed. All right, they're going to have to prove your speed and that your speed was what? Above speed limit. And then they have met their burden of proof. So they have done this. They have tilted the scales. If you stop at your speeding ticket trial and say, oh, judge, I give up, I'm done, then who's going to win? The government is going to win because they have met their burden of providing evidence of what? Unreasonable driving. But what if you don't sit there like a lump? What if you challenge the government? So the scales have been tilted. Now it is your burden to tilt the scales the other way by putting on proof of what? Ah, you got it. By putting on evidence of... Okay, you guys, this is the government, right? The government must prove unreasonable driving. They can provide evidence of that just by showing you were over the speed limit, which means your speed and above the speed limit, right? Now, what do you do to fight the ticket? Okay, so the defendant, you fighting your ticket, you now have the burden, once they've met the prima facie rule, you have the burden of proving what? Your speed was reasonable. Proving your speed was reasonable. How can you prove wait, stop. Is it possible that your speed was reasonable even though you were driving over the speed limit?